Okay, to make the most of our time together today, we're going to get started. So welcome everybody again, and thank you for joining us for the last class of the Legacy Learning Series, which was an online monthly learning series featuring legacy faculty members in honor of Pardes' 50th anniversary. Today, we have the honor of learning with Rav Meir Schweiger, and in many ways, it's very fitting that this is the last shiur of the series that he's teaching. Meir retired in 2020 after 43 years at teaching at Pardes, where he taught more hours and classes than anyone else on staff. He also served as the Mashgiach Ruchani, or spiritual director of Pardes, and was the director of the Pardes Fellows Program for returning second-year students, and the educational director for the Executive Learning Seminar. For 3 years, Meir was the mainstay of Pardes' podcast series on the weekly Torah portion, and he has over 200 recordings online. And he is also taught with Pardes Online in his weekly Parsha Shiur live with Rav Meir. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Rav Meir.
Okay, thank you very much, Yarden. I see quite a few familiar faces. I was told that I should really be very strict about time, so I will try to do that. We have an hour. I see also that at least some people that I know who have very, very good backgrounds, and there may be some other people who perhaps don't have as good. So you will bear with me and I'm sure that a number of you have probably gone through quite a few things which I have here. So I will definitely try to get to the punchline, which be in time, so to speak, before my time runs out. Okay, the shiur that I'm giving now is something that I did many, many years ago when I was teaching Mishnah at Pardes. And so what I'd like to do is, essentially, I assume everybody has the source sheet. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the source sheet, and I would just like to have one request. If during the course of the shiur, if there are certain things which I'm saying which are not clear, people would like to have some point of clarification, so feel free to ask, but I would rather reserve any comments that people have to the very end. Okay, so please bear with me because there's a lot of material and I will try to get through almost everything, I hope, but plus the punchline, which is essentially what's not on the page, which is why I wanted to do this particular shiur. Okay, so without any further ado, if we look at the first reference, which is a Mishnah, Tractate Kiddushin, chapter 1, Mishnah 7. So this is the Mishnah that becomes the basis of this concept of what's called mitzvot aseh shazman grama, time-bound commandments. If you wanted to be actually more precise, you would say time-caused commandments, that it's the time which causes the commandment. And I'm going to come back to that maybe later on. But for the moment, I'll use the generally accepted terminology, which is time-bound commandments. Mishnah says as follows, and you'll follow with me in the English. Okay, for all those of you who've been in my Parshat Shavua, so I don't know, some of you at least may be happy to see that I have translations for everything here in English. Okay, but what can I do? This is something which goes back a long time ago. In any case, all positive time-bound mitzvot, men are obligated, women are exempt. All positive mitzvot that are not time-bound, both men and women are obligated. So the Mishnah essentially is laying down two rules. When it comes to mitzvot, commandments which are time-bound, men are obligated, women are exempt. When it comes to commandments which, and here we're talking about positive commandments that are not time-bound, so both men and women are equally obligated. Okay, and the Mishnah states this as a general rule and typical to the Talmud. So the Talmud begins analyzing. So the first thing which we find in terms of the analysis is reference number 2. Okay, the sages taught in a breita, and again, just for those of you who may not be familiar, a breita is material from the time period of the Mishnah, which very often elaborates, expands on what is said in the Mishnah, and that's what we have over here. In this breita, it says, what is a positive time-bound mitzvah? So then they give the following examples. Sukkah, lulav, shofar, tzitzit, and tefillin I'm not going to translate it. I assume that everybody knows what that is. What is a positive mitzvah that is not time-bound? Mezuzah, a parapet, returning a lost item, and the bird's nest. Okay, mezuzah, everybody knows. I assume that returning a lost object, everybody knows. That's a positive commandment. A parapet is essentially an enclosure if you have a roof, let's say, or not only a roof. Okay, and we're concerned about the possibility of people falling off. So then you have to make sure that you build some type of railing on the roof so that no one is going to get hurt. Okay, and the last one is a bird's nest, that if you happen to be walking along and you see a bird's nest, so the halacha is that you can't take the mother together with the birds, but you have to send away the mother, and then only after that can you take the birds. Okay, so those are the examples of not time-bound commandments, which presumably women are obligated in. Okay, now what the Gemara does, which is very interesting, is to say, but is this an established principle? Behold, there are the mitzvot of matzah, rejoicing, and assembly, which are positive and time-bound, and yet women are obligated in them. And furthermore, there are the mitzvot of Torah study, procreation, redemption of the firstborn, which are positive and not time-bound, and yet women are exempt from them. So the Gemara immediately asks that here you are giving me this hard and fast rule, but in fact we find all kinds of exemptions. So for example, in the case of the time-bound commandments, the exceptions which are given are matzah, which I don't have to explain, right? Eating matzah at the Seder, rejoicing. There's a mitzvah that during the festivals, B'samachta bechagecha, you should rejoice during the festival. So women are obligated in rejoicing, although, well, we'll leave it at that for the moment. And assembly, what is assembly? So I'll say this now so that there is a mitzvah which in Hebrew is called hakel, where at the end of the sabbatical year, on the festival of Sukkot, right, on the first day of Chol HaMoed, there would be a public gathering, a public Torah reading, which was done by the king. And according to the Torah, not only are men supposed to be coming to this, but women as well. So, but this is clearly time-bound, and yet nevertheless, women are obligated. And then the other side of the coin is that there are non-time-bound commandments, okay, where women are exempt. Torah study, okay, procreation, right, the mitzvah of pru urevu, having children, right, for the moment, let's say a boy and a girl, women are exempt from that. And the last one, redemption of the firstborn, okay, that if you have a male child above the age of 30 days, I'm sorry. I mean, it's essentially the firstborn, a male child who's the firstborn. Then there is a mitzvah to redeem the child, give 5 shkalim to a kohen, and that mitzvah is incumbent upon the father, not upon the mother. Okay, so now, but what the point which the Gemara is making is, you're giving me these rules, but there are all these exceptions to the rules. And then you have Rabbi Yochanan who says, one does not learn from general statements. Okay, there's a rule, big deal, which is a little bit of a problematic statement. And as we're going to see as we go along, in fact, there may be more exceptions than the rule, in which case, so then what's the point of creating a rule? So this is the first thing that I think we should note, that here is the Mishnah that gives me a rule. Then we discover that there are exceptions. It may in fact be that there are more exceptions than the actual rule. And Rabbi Yochanan doesn't seem to be perturbed by that. So he said, okay, so don't learn from the rule. Now, the simple way of taking it is that just because there's a rule doesn't mean that there can't be exceptions. But the problem, and I speak for myself now, when I was learning this many, many years ago, so the part that bothered me was, but what's okay, I'm willing to accept the fact that, in other words, I have a rule, and even though it's a rule, there can be exceptions to the rule. But what happens when there are so many exceptions? Then what's the point of having a rule? And that's essentially what I'd like to discuss, but that will have to wait to the end. Okay, now I want to continue with what the Gemara brings, and as you see, when I have 3 dots there, I'm cutting down the discussion because I'm trying to speak fast so that I can get in whatever I'd like to get in. The Gemara then goes on to say, after having given me the examples of time-bound and giving me the examples of non-time-bound, showing that there are exceptions to the rule, and then saying, yes, even though we have a rule, there definitely are exceptions to the rule. Now the question is, but where do we get this from? And if you look in the middle of number 2, from where do we derive that women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot? So the Gemara says it is derived from tefillin. Just as women are exempt from tefillin, so too women are exempt from all positive time-bound mitzvot. And tefillin is derived from Torah study. Just as women are exempt from Torah study, so too are women exempt from tefillin. Okay, so let me pause now just to say this. The Gemara is giving the source. So the source ultimately comes to tefillin. Women are exempt from tefillin. Tefillin is a time-bound commandment. Now, why is tefillin called a time-bound commandment? So this is actually a discussion that appears in different places in the Talmud, but either because you don't put on tefillin at night, or because we don't put on tefillin on Shabbat and festivals, without going into a whole discussion about this. So tefillin does have only certain specific times when we put them on. And so we say tefillin is time-bound. So we are now essentially doing a principle for the moment of a principle of exegesis, which is known as a binyan av, which means that when I find one example of something, I then try to extrapolate a general category. And in this case, so if tefillin is a time-bound commandment, women are exempt from it, so too, women are exempt from all time-bound commandments. Okay, and the only problem is, but how do I know women are exempt from tefillin? So the answer which the Gemara says is, well, it's because tefillin is juxtaposed in the Shema to studying Torah. Okay, and just as women are exempt from studying Torah, so too women are exempt from tefillin, which then means for the moment, and this is really fascinating, that ultimately the rule of women being exempt from time-bound commandments is actually based ultimately on Talmud Torah, which is not a time-bound commandment, which is a kind of, irony over here. That's number one. Number two, what you don't have over here, so I'll just throw it in now because it does appear in the Gemara, is, but how do I know women are exempt from Talmud Torah? So I'll say this right now. Well, it says in the verse, right? You shall teach your sons, b'shinantam levanecha. Okay? And so we make a drash which says, Shinantam levanecha means your sons and not your daughters. Or it says, v'limadatem otam in the second paragraph, et b'nechem. So the Gemara says, b'nechem below b'notechem. Okay, and I would again, I'm throwing this out right now. Maybe putting out on the table, so to speak, more questions than answers. On a certain level, it seems to be arbitrary because, well, why can't I say b'nechem? Yes, it says sons, but that's the language that you generally speak in the Torah. You use the masculine. So why do I have to say that it means sons and not daughters? Now, there's a serious question over here. To what extent is this an actual halacha which is being derived from the text? Or to what extent is this something which is It's like I have the halacha and now I try to read it into the text. Okay, and I would say personally that my inclination is that there may very well have been a tradition of women being exempt from Torah study, and then that tradition is now being hanged on this verse, but it's not so clear that the verse is definitely teaching me that. It's more I'm using the verse as a sort of anchor or support to an oral tradition. Okay, now the reason why I'm raising this point is because my feeling is that when you read this Gemara, there are many things here that are very, very tenuous. And it seems to be that it's as if, we have these rules, and then it's the rabbis who are then coming along and trying to somehow read back and try to somehow justify, if you want to use that language, the rules that we have, and are bringing certainly a variety of verses. But ultimately, it may be something which is rooted in some sort of oral tradition. And that's what I'm eventually going to be speaking about later on. So what is this tradition and why is it there? And what is it teaching us? In any case, so as I said, when we asked what is the source for this rule, so the explanation that's given is, well, we derive it from tefillin, and tefillin is derived from Talmud Torah, and that ultimately, as I said, paradoxically, the principle of women being exempt from time-bound commandments is based on a mitzvah, Talmud Torah, which itself is not time-bound. Okay, and then, so let's just continue. The Gemara then says, well, this is all based on the juxtaposition in the Shema between the verses that speak about tefillin and Talmud Torah. So then they say, so let us say, okay, the opposite. Juxtapose tefillin to mezuzah, because in the Shema, we also have, if you check the verses, a juxtaposition between tefillin and mezuzah. And excuse me, and as we said earlier, women are actually obligated in mezuzah, right? Mezuzah is also not time-bound. So then why don't we say, just as women are obligated in mezuzah, they should be obligated in tefillin? So the answer which the Gemara gives is, tefillin is juxtaposed to Torah study in both the first paragraph and in the second paragraph, whereas tefillin is not juxtaposed to mezuzah in the second paragraph, okay? In other words, if you read the Shema, you'll see that there's a difference in the order of the verses between tefillin, studying Torah, and mezuzah in the first paragraph. We start off with tefillin, Talmud Torah, and then afterwards we have mezuzah. In the second paragraph, we start off with Talmud Torah, tefillin, and then mezuzah. And so what you're saying is, in both paragraphs, tefillin is juxtaposed to study of Torah, but it's only in the second paragraph. I'm sorry, it's only in the first paragraph that tefillin is juxtaposed to mezuzah. So therefore, there's more of a connection between tefillin and Talmud Torah. And then the Gemara says at the very end of this discussion, so let us juxtapose mezuzah to Torah study and thereby exempt women. Because, well, we have Torah study, which is juxtaposed to mezuzah. So then why don't we say, just as women are exempt from Torah study, they're exempt from mezuzah? And then look at the answer which the Gemara gives. Do not let this enter your mind, for it is written, in order that your days will increase. Do men need life, whereas women not? Right? In other words, right after, in the second paragraph of the Shema, after it says, you shall write these on your doorposts, it says, in order, leman yirbu mechem, that your days shall increase. So somehow it seems that by observing the mitzvah mezuzah, that gives you long life. So what? Men need to have long life. Women don't, right? A rhetorical question. So clearly, right, women have to be obligated in this. Okay, now, The Gemara then goes on, and as I see, my time is starting to move. So I'll just say, if you look at the last paragraph on the first page, so we have a whole discussion about sukkah, okay? And the Gemara says, well, the sukkah is a time-bound commandment, and yet it seems to be, and on that basis, we should say that women are exempt from sukkah. But it seems to be the reason that it says, or the drash which they make, is by sukkah. It says, Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshvu b'sukkot, that all the citizens of Israel shall sit in the sukkah. And on the basis of that drash, so what they say is citizens is coming to exclude women. But the Gemara asks, but why do you need to have a special drash to do that, when simply you could say it's a time-bound commandment? So the Gemara then says, because I might have had a reason why I would obligate women by sukkah, because it says you shall, basukot teshvu, you shall settle down in the sukkah, and the Gemara makes a drash that the sukkah for those 7 days should be your home. And so therefore I would have said, in the same way in your home, you have men and women who are living at home, so too, the sukkah, which is now your home, should be a place where you have both men and women living. And on that basis, we should say women are obligated. And the answer is, we don't say it, because of this drash of Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael, which is now excluding women. Okay, so now I want to just point out that it's very, very interesting that we're now entering the realm of why would we make exceptions to this general rule of time-bound commandments. And sukkah, for example, there would be a reason to make an exception to that rule, because you would say the sukkah for those 7 days becomes your home. And in your home, right, the normal way that you live is to have men and women living at home. So then they should also be living in the sukkah. And therefore, women should be equally obligated to be in the sukkah. But then we have a special drash. Kol ha'ezrach, the citizen, is now coming to exclude women. Okay? For the moment, okay? And again, I don't want to get into a whole discussion about this now. I'll come back to it or touch on it maybe a little bit later, that it could very well be that the definition of a citizen may be, as was in ancient times, someone who owns land. And as you see in various places in the Torah, okay, women were not necessarily landholders, because the giving of land and the inheritance of land essentially went through the men. So even though there could be a possibility, as you find the story of Benot Slavchad, of women being given land, but that was exceptional. And so as a result, so you're saying if Ezrach is defined as a landholder, then that would be excluding women as a general rule. Okay, so that's sukkah. Okay, now let's look at page number 2. The Mishnah then asks the question of appearance. Now, what is appearance? Appearance is the mitzvah of going to the temple on the 3 festivals, Aliyah Regel. Okay, and it's not just going to the temple, but also bringing certain sacrifices. And so once again, right, women are exempt, or should be exempt, because it's time-bound. But the Gemara seems to say that the reason why women are exempt is because it says all the males to the exclusion of the women. So the question is, so why did the Torah have to highlight the males? Because we should have understood that from this general principle we have. And the answer is because we might have made an analogy between Aliyah Regel and the mitzvah, which I mentioned earlier, of Hakel, of this public Torah reading, which is done in the aftermath of the sabbatical year. And there, women are obligated to come up to the temple to hear this public Torah reading. So I would have said, in the same way they come to that, they should also be coming anytime on the 3 festivals, right, and bring an offering. And so, so that's why we needed to have the Torah say explicitly the males are obligated, not the women. Okay, now I want to just look at the last thing, which is the second reference on the top of page 2, where if you see where it says 35a, it says Rava said the sages of Papunya know the reason for this matter, namely why are women exempt from Torah-bound mitzvot, and who is the sages of Papunya? It is Rav Achabar Yaakov who said, the verse states, and it shall be a sign for you on your arm and for a memorial between your eyes, that the Torah of the Lord may be in your mouth. The entire Torah is juxtaposed to tefillin. Just as tefillin is a positive time-bound mitzvah from which women are exempt, so too are women exempt from every positive time-bound mitzvah. So here, this is very interesting because remember I said to you earlier that it seems that the way that we get this general rule is because of an exegetical principle, what's called binyan av, that once I find one example, then I extrapolate a whole rule from it. But I just want to point out, well, women are exempt from tefillin for the moment, as we mentioned, because of the juxtaposition to studying Torah. But the fact of the matter is, but there are things that women are obligated in. And so therefore, then the question would be, so why did you pick tefillin, right, to create your general rule? Why don't you create a general rule from a mitzvah taseh where women are obligated? And then the answer essentially is because of this verse, at least according to the sages of Papunya, that because of the juxtaposition of tefillin to Torah in general, so then we say that whatever is true of tefillin becomes now a general principle of mitzvot. And so it isn't just because of a binyan av, but it's because of this juxtaposition. Okay, now what I would like to look at, and what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to skip for a moment, okay, and I want to look at reference. Let me just find this because I'm a little bit conscious of our time constraint. Look at number 4 at the bottom of page 2. It's about 5 lines from the bottom. It says, Rav Ada bar Ahava said. Rav Ada bar Ahava said, women are obligated to recite Kiddush by Torah law. And why? Isn't Kiddush a time-bound positive mitzvah, and women are exempt from all time-bound positive mitzvot? So Abaye said, indeed, women are obligated to recite Kiddush only by rabbinic law, but not by Torah law. Whereas Rava said, Rava said to Abaye, but Rav Ada bar Ahava said Torah law. And furthermore, if this is true, then for all time-bound commandments, we should obligate women rabbinically. Rather, Rava said, the verse says, remember Shabbat, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, and it says observe Shamor. Anyone included in the obligation to observe is also included in the mitzvah to remember. Okay, so what he says is that women are obligated in Kiddush because we have Zachor, for all of you familiar with from Lecha Dodi, Zachor v'Shamor b'dibur echad were both said in one utterance. So what we say is whoever is obligated in observing Shabbat is obligated in remembering. The rabbis connect the observance of Shabbat with the prohibitions of Shabbat. Remembering Shabbat is the source for making Kiddush on Shabbat. So we say women are obligated in all of the prohibitions of Shabbat, which I didn't bring up earlier because there's another statement in the Mishnah in Kiddushin that says women are obligated in all prohibitions as well as men, except for a number of exceptions, right? Shaving your beard, cutting off your payot. We're not going to get into that. But in principle, women are obligated in all prohibitions. So if women are obligated in all of the prohibitions of Shabbat, they're also obligated in making Kiddush. So Kiddush is an exception to the rule of, to the rule of time-bound commandments because of Zachor v'Shamor. I will add, this comes up in another reference later on, and I don't want to look at it right now to save time, but it's not only Kiddush, but women are obligated also have to have 3 meals a day on Shabbat, to have Lechem Mishnah, meaning whatever positive commandments we have on Shabbat, women are equally obligated as men. Okay, so making Shabbat becomes an exception, a very serious exception, to this rule of time-bound commandments. Furthermore, and here I'm going to skip to reference number 7 on page 3, the bottom of page 3. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said women are obligated to light Hanukkah candles because they too were in that miracle. And if you go to page 4 at the top, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said women are obligated to drink 4 cups of wine because they too were in that miracle. And then Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said women are obligated in the reading of the Megillah because they too were in that miracle, which means I have 3 statements by the same person, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, who was addressing what we could call rabbinic mitzvot and saying that are time-bound, and saying despite the fact that they're time-bound, women are obligated. Lighting Hanukkah candles, having 4 cups of wine on Pesach, and reading the Megillah, and all 3 have the same underlying reason because they too were in the miracle. And there's a whole discussion, and I will take what seems to me the simplest reading of they also were in the miracle, which means that in the same way that the men experienced the deliverance, okay, the victory during Hanukkah and the deliverance from Haman on Purim, and ultimately, right, the exodus from Egypt. So because they also experienced that miraculous deliverance, they are now obligated to do these things. So we have 3 other exceptions to this rule of being time-bound. Maybe right now, I'll just mention, we had it earlier, that the Gemara said women are obligated to eat matzah on the Seder night. Okay, and in effect, women are actually obligated in all of the mitzvot on the Seder night. And the reason being because there's a juxtaposition between the prohibition of eating chametz and the mitzvah of eating matzah. And so similar to Shabbat, we say whoever is prohibited from eating chametz is also arba kosot is rabbinic. Okay, whoever is prohibited from eating chametz is obligated to eat matzah on the Seder night. So essentially, what I want you to, what I would like to point out is, so on the one hand, women are obligated in the positive mitzvot of Shabbat. Women are also obligated in all the positive mitzvot of the Seder. And in both cases, the reasoning is, once they're obligated in the prohibitions, then they're obligated in the flip side, which are the positive commandments. Okay? So that's as far as matzah goes. The reason why I skipped is because I want to now go back to reference number 3 and then 4, the beginning of 4, because for me, this becomes a key in at least developing a certain idea behind this rule of time-bound commandments. So reference number 3 is a Mishnah from Masechet Brachot, which says women, slaves, and minors are exempt from the recitation of Shema and from Tefillin, but are obligated in prayer, mezuzah, and Birkat Hamazon. So we've already discussed tefillin. Excuse me, we've also discussed mezuzah. But two things which come up here, and Birkat HaMazon, yes, comes up also. I'll leave Birkat HaMazon for the moment. What I want to focus on is the recitation of the Shema and prayer. So now let's look at what the Gemara says. Reference number 4. The Gemara starts out by saying women are exempt from the recitation of the Shema, and the Gemara says that's obvious, as Shema is a time-bound positive mitzvah, and women are exempt from all time-bound positive mitzvot. And then what they say is, well, I need the Mishnah to tell me that, because I might have thought that there's a reason why women should be obligated. Lest you say, since Shema includes the acceptance of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, and in brackets it says, so perhaps women are obligated, therefore the Mishnah teaches us that nevertheless women are exempt. Okay? So now, remember I mentioned earlier that we have the rule, but then at various times we have considerations for why something should be an exception to the rule. And there are some cases where in the end we accept that consideration, but there may be other cases where we might have thought that and then we reject it. So here we're saying in the case of the Shema, there's a reason why I would have thought that women should be obligated. Why? Because Shema has Kabbalat Al Malchut Shamayim. When you say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that is in other places in the Mishnah in the Talmudic discussion we see, this is the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. So I would have said, well, clearly women should be accepting the yoke of heaven. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches me that women are exempt. Now, I just want to point out, when the Gemara says kamash malan, therefore it teaches us, it's not clear. So what exactly does it teach me? Now, there are actually two conclusions that you could draw from this. One conclusion is to say, well, I would have thought that women are obligated in accepting the yoke of heaven. And so when the Mishnah says they're exempt, what's the Mishnah saying? They don't have to accept the yoke of heaven, which would seem to be a little bit problematic. So the alternative would be to say, yeah, women are obligated to accept the yoke of heaven, but nevertheless, they're exempt from the Shema, and therefore what we're doing is we're making a certain separation between accepting the yoke of heaven, which they would be obligated to do, and saying the Shema. And maybe I'll just point this out right now. Okay, it'll feed into something which I'll say later on. In fact, in Halacha, it's brought in the Shulchan Aruch, it's brought down that despite the fact that women are exempt from Shema, women should nevertheless recite the first line of the Shema, because the first line of the Shema is the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, which means that there's a distinction between the first line of the Shema, which has accepting the yoke of heaven, and Kriyat Shema, the recitation, which is saying 3 paragraphs. Saying 3 paragraphs, which is the Shema, women are exempt from. But accepting the yoke of heaven, women should do, and that you can do by simply saying the first line of the Shema. Okay? So that's how I will understand that comment. Now let's skip where it says from tefillin. Okay, so let's look where it says they're obligated in prayer. Okay, now I want to point out that generally in the Mishnah in Brachot, and not only the Mishnah in the Talmud, when they discuss prayer, generally the reference is to what we call the Amidah, the Shmona Esrei. There are certain exceptions to that where the Gemara uses the term prayer for other specific types of prayers. But by and large, when they use the term prayer, It's a reference to the Shmona Esrei. And what I would say is in this Mishnah, the fact that we're contrasting Shema and Tfilah, the simplest way of taking it is that Tfilah here means the Amidah. And now let's look at what the Gemara says. It says, since prayer is supplication for mercy. The Gemara is giving the explanation, why are women obligated? Because this is supplication for mercy. Unless you say, since regarding prayer it is written evening, morning, and afternoon, perhaps prayer should be considered as a time-bound positive mitzvah. Hence, the Mishnah teaches us that women are obligated. So here what it says is, well, look, right? We have a verse which says evening, morning, and afternoon, and we know that there are 3 times a day that you say the Amidah. So then we would have said this should be considered to be a time-bound commandment. Women should be exempt. Yet nevertheless, the Mishnah teaches me they're obligated. Why? Supplication for mercy. Okay, so this is something when I many years ago was teaching Mishnah, it really, and then teaching the Gemara on it, it really bothered me because it seems to be on a certain level arbitrary. It's like the Mishnah, like I said, it's like you have the target and now and you circle the target and then, after you've already, put the bullseye in. And it's the idea that I have Shema on the one hand, I have Amidah on the other hand. Both of them I could consider to be time-bound. Both of them have considerations as to why we should obligate women despite the fact that it's time-bound. In the Shema, it seems to be that the fact that it's time-bound overrides the consideration of accepting the yoke of heaven. In the Amidah, it seems the consideration for supplication for mercy overrides it being time-bound. And that was something that bothered me. Like, why is it in one case, right, you're willing to have some other consideration override time-bound, and in the other case, time-bound overrides that consideration? Keep that question, okay, hold on to that for one moment. And because I'm going to have to start wrapping up, I just want to point out that if you look at reference number 8, everybody see it? It says this is from Masechet Eruvin. It was taught in a Braita that Michal, the daughter of Cushi, meaning King Saul, would wear tefillin, and the sages did not protest. And similarly, Jonah's wife would undertake the festival pilgrimage, and the sages did not protest against her practice. Okay, and so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what I just want to point out is this Gemara raises a very interesting question. When we say women are exempt from time-bound commandments, doesn't mean that they're exempt in the sense they're not obligated, but if they want, they can do it. Or does it mean that, in other words, they're exempt and they're actually forbidden to do it? And if they're forbidden, we should protest women doing it. And this Gemara scene gives you 2 examples where it seems that women were doing these time-bound commandments. The sages did not protest. And from this Gemara, it seems to be that, at least from this Gemara, that although women are exempt, if they want to do it, they have the option to do it. It is not forbidden to do it. Okay? So now I just want to point out reference number 9. This is a halachic work called the Tashbetz. Rabbi Shimon ben Tzemach Duran, he was someone who lived in Barcelona in the 1300s, 1400s. Okay, and he wrote a halachic work, and in it he says, women are exempt from tefillin and tzitzit because both are time bound. Tefillin is not worn on Shabbos, tzitzit are not at night. Nevertheless, one should not protest women who wrap themselves in tzitzit and make a blessing upon them, since women can obligate themselves in the mitzvah. Okay, so what he's saying is, and essentially it seems to be based on this Gemara, Masechet Eruvin, that women could obligate them. And the reason why he says they can obligate themselves is because otherwise, how can they say, you commanded us to do this, right? You make a blessing on it. So he seems to be of the opinion that women are exempt, but they can do it. And not only can they do it, they can obligate to the point where they can make a blessing on it. Okay, now I just want to point out that this is not universally agreed upon. This is the basis of a whole discussion. But look at what he says at the end, which is also very interesting. Nevertheless, they should not put on tefillin since they do not know how to guard them in purity. But he said, but women nevertheless shouldn't put on tefillin. Why? Because, essentially what he's saying is because it could be that they're menstruating, or they might menstruate, and if they do so, that would not be responsible for the tefillin. And so that because there is a halakha that if you don't feel that you can show tefillin proper respect because of discharges that come out of your body, right? For example, by a man, if you have to go to the bathroom, right? Or by even a young boy, right? That you may pass gas or do something certain things which may be beyond your control. So then don't put on tefillin. Okay, but that's a kind of separate consideration. Okay, I want to point out, I'm going to skip also number 11. What I want to look at now, and then I'll give you my take on it since I have about 5 minutes left, is the Abudraham. The Abudraham, David Abudraham, the last reference, is someone who lived in the 1300s in Spain, and he wrote a halachic work, different practices on, Shema and Tefillah and blessings. And he not only tells you the halakha, but a lot of times he tries to give you the reasoning behind the halakha, what's the explanation of it. So look what he says as far as our topic. The blessing over commandments and their laws. The reason why women are exempt from time-bound commandments is that a woman is committed, bound to her husband to perform all his needs. If she were to be commanded to do time-bound commandments, then there could be a situation where at the time of her performance of a mitzvah, her husband would command her to do his bidding. If she will do the commandments of her creator and leave aside his bidding, woe to her from her husband. But if she were to do her husband's bidding and leave aside the commandments of her creator, woe to her from her maker. Therefore, the creator exempted her from the commandments in order that she should be peace with her husband. Okay? Now, I understand this is not politically correct, right? And it's not, something that people can easily relate to, but his explanation is, well, because a woman has a commitment to God, she has a commitment to her husband. It could be that those two commitments will come in conflict with each other. And as a result of that, God in his mercy and God in his desire to have peace between a husband and wife, so God says, you know what? I'm willing to forego time-bound commandments so that if your husband wants you to do something and it's not time-bound, so then, and it is time-bound, so then you should be taking care of what your husband's asking you to do. And now, if I didn't see who had said it, but someone said, and what if you don't have a husband? Excellent question. So now I'll just point out there are other commentaries who want to say something along those lines and say, well, women can't be doing time-bound commandments because women are busy taking care of their children. And if they're taking care of their children, so then that takes priority. And again, you could say God, understanding that a woman in her role, right, in those roles we don't want to create a conflict. And as a result, God is in God's magnanimity, is exempting women so that they don't have to feel conflicted. So that, as was brought up on the screen, raises a question about what about those women who don't have a husband? What about the period before you have a husband? Maybe the period after you have a husband, before you have kids, after. Now, I could just say that you could theoretically say, well, once there's going to be a certain period in your life that you're exempt. So it's not like, oh, well, at this point in your life, you're obligated. At this point, you're exempt. Go back to being obligated. It doesn't work that way. Either you're obligated, and if you're obligated, from the moment you're obligated forever, or not. It's like a zero-sum game, okay? All or nothing. So that's generally what's seen as the classic explanation. So I would like to suggest a different explanation based on what I showed you earlier in terms of this difference between Shema and between the Amidah. And so my suggestion is the following. And by the way, again, I'm saying this in terms because it fits into what you would understand certain rabbinic ways of looking at this gender division between men and women. So in simple language, the difference between Shema and between the Amidah highlights what I call a difference between those mitzvot that are experiential versus those mitzvot that are formal. And essentially what the rabbis are saying is women are exempt from formal mitzvot in principle. They're obligated in those mitzvot which are experiential. And I'll just say this right now because, again, my time is running out, that it could very well be that in many mitzvot, you have both aspects, and then it might be that the rabbis at a certain point are saying, but what do I see as being at the core of the mitzvah? And it's that core, which then is the basis for why I would exempt, but in the case of time bound, but it might very well be because there may be multiple facets, that maybe there's a certain fluidity as well. So let me just explain this, flesh it out in 2 minutes. And I'm sorry, Yarden, I'll try to really stick to the time. Why do I call Shema a formal mitzvah? And why do I call Tefillah, an experiential mitzvah? So although the Amidah has a fixed, time and also a fixed text, but the Amidah is not so fixed. Because in fact, we know that if a person wants to, and not only if they want to, they might even be encouraged to, they should actually, in the various blessings, put an insertion, in the requests, in other words, your own personal insertion. Tefillah, the Amidah, is referred to many, many times as being what we call avodah shebalev. And so therefore, the Tefillah at its core is what I would call an I-thou encounter. The Shema has Kabbalat al Malchut Shamayim, which essentially you do in the first verse. But the obligation of saying the Shema is to say 3 paragraphs. We have to say them in a certain way. We have to make sure we enunciate it properly. Each word is critical. That's not true in the case of even the Amidah. And that also explains, we have differences, Nusach Sfard, Nusach Ashkenaz. So essentially, the way that I understand the Shema, you'll excuse me for using this analogy. The Shema is my pledge of allegiance. Essentially, when I say the Shema, here I am every day, twice a day, saying, God, I pledge my allegiance to you. You are my God. Okay? By the way, if anybody will look at, Masechet Brachot, you'll see that the whole discussion of Kavanah is radically different when they talk about the Amidah versus the Shema. Yes, there is a concept of Kavanah by the Shema, but on a certain level, the Kavanah is minimal. There's much more of a discussion of the technical, proper recitation. By the Amidah, okay, the discussion is that of Kavanah is at the core of the Amidah. Now, having said that, okay, so my understanding is mitzvot that are time-bound, in their essence, are formal mitzvot. And what do I mean by that? It's that when this time comes, okay, then it's my obligation to now acknowledge God, whether I'm in the mood, whether I'm not in the mood, okay? But the emphasis is I have an obligation to now serve God, acknowledge God, and that's at the core of things which are time-bound. I would even say another thing, which again fits into the rabbinic understanding, this whole separation, by the way, time creates a structure, okay? A structure which is the most rigid type of structure. Structure, okay, is formal, okay? It's not free-flowing. And I would add the last point, which is that formal mitzvot are very much communal oriented. Experiential mitzvot are personal, are individual. And this fits in with a certain rabbinic gender separation of having men play more of what we would call a communal role, as opposed to women who are seen as more in the private realm. Now, if you take, for example, the various exceptions, so I just want to point out that Shabbat, Pesach, okay, reading Megillah, lighting Hanukkah candles, right? Evidently, what you see from the Gemara is that these are meant to be, at their core, experiential mitzvot. On the other hand, I just want to point out that it's interesting that Talmud Torah is not being put in the category of an experiential mitzvah. It's being put in the category of what I would call a formal mitzvah. And by the way, the source for Talmud Torah is V'shinantam levanecha v'limadetem otam et b'nechem. The mitzvah of Talmud Torah at its core is teaching your children, what I would call handing down the tradition. It's not that the mitzvah is I study Torah in order that I should be knowledgeable, in order that when I do mitzvot, it should be more meaningful. I study Torah because that puts me in that chain of tradition and I need to be handing that out. Okay, whether I like it, whether I don't like what I'm studying, I have to do it because I want to perpetuate the tradition. Now, obviously, there is the experiential element of Talmud Torah, which is essentially why I think that it's become more and more acceptable to have women study Torah and even Gemara, whatever realms there are. But it's seen as, again, highlighting what I would call more the experiential dimension. By the way, I'll just end with this last thing. Even having children, okay, you could say, why do we have children? Well, it's because it's very important, because it's very meaningful, right? But from the Torah's perspective, the reason why you have children is because this is how you populate the world. This is how you dominate the world. It's a social obligation that I have. I need to have children because we need to dominate the world. Okay, I see the question, does exempt mean prohibited? So again, this is a discussion that you have. I would say that by and large, and that's what I showed you in the sources that I brought, the generally accepted thrust is that that exempt does not mean prohibited. And therefore, there is the possibility that, in other words, if one wants to do that, you can. And as the Tashbeit said, you can obligate yourself and even on that basis make a bracha. So that's what seems to be the generally accepted thing. There is a whole discussion about tefillin, as you saw, one part which was brought up because of, purity, because of cleanliness. There's a whole other discussion, but I don't want to get into that now, about even tzitzit, to what extent might that come under the category of being male garb? Okay, and therefore there's a prohibition in the Torah of women wearing male garb. There is a Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel who says that women should not put on tefillin or tzitzit because it's male garb. Okay, but in principle, it seems, and certainly we see this in the reality, that, and certainly I would say, certainly in Ashkenazi circles, in Sephardi a little bit less, that in fact women are women can take upon themselves the obligation, and in such a situation, they would make the blessing as well. I saw, Richard, you put something about hakel. So hakel actually becomes very interesting because on the one hand, it's Talmud Torah, but women are obligated in hakel. And the reason is because at its core, hakel, and this is my understanding, is a reenactment of the Sinai experience. In the same way the women were present at Mount Sinai and they were clearly included as in that experience of this, like what I call the I thou encounter. So the reenactment of that experience, okay, is what happens in Hakel. Now, by the same token, this would raise a question, on any given Shabbat, when you have the reading of the Torah, how do you understand the reading of the Torah? Is reading Torah simply studying Torah? Or is reading Torah kind of reenactment of the Sinai experience? If you see as a reenactment of the Sinai experience, then there would be more of a reason to say that women, would be obligated in it. If you see it as being Talmud Torah, again, giving what it says, then maybe it's more of a formality that we do and women would be exempt. Okay, my time is up. I promised that I would end and I'm a little bit over. So if there are any questions, comments, please feel free. I at least try to get in my thesis of and I apologize because I realized it wasn't. Yes, it was trying to get in a lot of material in a very limited amount of time. But I think the purpose of was to have to at least open up something what I consider to be food for thought and give you maybe a certain approach, which I haven't seen anywhere else. So take it or leave it, as I say, for whatever. But if people would like to stay for a few more minutes, I understand we have that possibility. Questions, comments? So do I take that as silence?
I see Noah has her hand raised.
What? Noah?
Hi.
Hi, Noah. A long
Nice
time
to
I haven't
see
seen you.
It's only been 25 years, and what a treat to learn with you. So I keep thinking about when I ask my kids to empty the dishwasher and they do it versus when they actually just take it upon themselves to empty the dishwasher. Right? And the latter, when they just do it on their own without being asked, seems like a greater offering to our household. And so I'm curious if there's any text or any thoughts about when women take on mitzvot that are not obligated, if there's sort of a greater value.
Okay. You have in the Gemara statement, which actually comes up in another context of someone who's blind, where the Gemara says, it comes up actually in the, why should I pick that? It comes up in the case of Kibud Ava'im, where the Gemara says, Gadol ha-mitzuveh oseh mi she'eno mitzuveh oseh. Greater is the person who is commanded to do something more than the person who is not commanded and nevertheless does it. So on a certain level, that statement is counterintuitive because you would assume, obviously, if you, of your own volition, decide to do something, that should certainly be much more commendable, much more admirable than having somebody who's telling you to do it. So the explanation which I've heard, which I like, is the fact that the question is one of consistency. And the idea being, if somebody really takes seriously that they're commanded to do something, then they're going to do it on a consistent basis. If you do something on a volunteer basis, it could very well be that you will do it, but it could also very well be that, when certain circumstances present themselves, that you'll say to yourself, well, but I'm not really obligated anyway, so you won't do it. And as a result, you don't necessarily get that consistency. By the way, you should know that this is the way that I understand why Abraham commanded his servant, right, to find a wife for Yitzchak and gave him all kinds of provisions. He didn't command him, he made him take an oath, right? But it's similar to commanding him. And why, in effect, Jacob made Joseph take an oath that under no circumstances he bury him in Egypt, but he has to bury him back there, because the assumption is that it's not enough to just rely on his goodwill, but he wanted to actually bind him, because if he's binding him, so then there's no way out. If it's based on his goodwill, then he can always say, well, I really wanted to do it, but there were extenuating circumstances. Now, if you had somebody who actually bound themselves and is consistent throughout, as they say, tavo alav or aleha bracha, and let God be the judge of what the credits they get. But I'm just explaining to you what would be the traditional explanation of why being bound is seen as being maybe a greater thing than not being bound. Yes. Anyone else?
Richard, go ahead.
Richard.
Regarding women's performing mitzvot performing mitzvot that they're not obligated for and saying the bracha, you brought a couple of sources that justify that on the theory that they are obligating themselves.
Correct.
Aren't there sources that allow women to perform those mitzvot and say the bracha without actually incurring an obligation, and thus doing it on an occasional basis, but not a regular and obligatory basis?
Okay, so again, my assumption would be that even the ones that I brought you would not necessarily be saying that, in other words, you could only make a bracha if you take upon yourselves that you will from now on do this. I mean, it's just the fact that I think it's just that implicit in the act that by now doing it, it's as if you've put yourself into that community of obligation, so to speak. But it doesn't necessarily mean that in order to say the bracha, you would have to actually commit yourself a priori to do that. Okay, so that's my understanding. Okay, and there are other people who formulate it, slightly differently and say that, who raise it, even in terms of, people making brachot on rabbinic commandments. How can you make a bracha on a rabbinic commandment if God didn't actually command you to do it? So the answer is, but God did say that they should listen to what the rabbis say. So it's as if God indirectly is commanding you. So then you, as I said, so using that type of logic, you might also say that, in other words, God did command certain segments of the population to do this. And the minute you now want to do this and you do it, then it's that you're putting yourself into that framework of commandment. And as a result, you can make the bracha. But again, I don't think that it means that you have to actually commit yourself a priori that from now on, I'm going to be doing this. Did that answer the question, Richard?
That's an answer, yes, thank you.
Yeah, Dane, anyone else?
I don't see anyone with their hands up. So...
Okay, everyone, thank you very much. It was my pleasure to be able to be with you, to see a number of faces I haven't seen in a long time, and certainly those who I do see on a regular or have seen on a regular basis. It's been a pleasure, and if Bezrat Hashem, we should have other opportunities.
Thanks
Thank
so
you
much.
so-
Thank you.
Thank you, Rav
Okay.
Meir, and thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of your day.
Always
Okay.
a treat to learn with you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone.